The rope itched where it kissed Marlowe Thorne's throat, a coarse, unforgiving circle that turned each breath into a bargain she wasn't sure she could keep paying. She stood on the wooden platform in the center of Bitter Creek Square, hands bound behind her, shoulders squared out of stubbornness more than courage. To those gathered, 40 souls by a generous count, she was a picture framed for judgment, a black, full-figured seamstress whose quiet life had become spectacle. Dust lifted in small, nervous swirls beneath the gallows, and the sky pressed down with a blunt, indifferent heat. Judge Harrison Blackwood read the sentence as if savoring every syllable. His voice, iron-thick and courtroom-sure, bounced against storefront glass and jittery whispers. Theft of an emerald necklace, property of his esteemed wife. Crime proven, punishment ordained. He held a silver watch in his palm and let the seconds click loud enough to be heard. When he nodded to the executioner, Garrett Walsh, a narrow man with a careful frown, the trapdoor creaked in reply. Marlowe felt the boards tremble through the soles of her boots and closed her eyes on instinct. No prayer came. Words had stopped visiting her days ago, somewhere between the bad lawyer, the worst trial, and the cell that smelled like rust. She had told the truth. She'd been hemming a dress in the Blackwood parlor when the judge's wife slipped into the garden and buried something wrapped in silk. She had told the wrong person, Hiram Wells, appointed by the court and loyal to convenience. He called her story hysterical embroidery, smirked at his own pun, and let her case collapse like a cheap seam. What clung to her now, tighter than the rope, was the quiet understanding that in Bitter Creek a poor orphan's word weighed less than a rich woman's silence. The crowd scattered their attention anywhere but her face. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, stood with her lips set thin. Old Tom Fletcher's hat rode high on his head, as if he'd forgotten how to wear it right. Children fogged the mercantile windows with breathless curiosity. Sheriff Wade Morrison planted himself near the stairs, hand hovering by his holster, a statue of duty with a crack beginning to show. Somewhere a hinge squealed. Somewhere a horse stamped against a hitching post, as if impatient for the afternoon to be done. Blackwood found Marlowe's eyes. What looked back at him wasn't so much defiance as refusal to vanish. He answered with a small, satisfied narrowing of his gaze. The watch snapped shut in his hand, a neat, mechanical verdict. Garrett shifted, reaching for the lever. That was when the spurs started talking. The sound came slow and deliberate up the back stairs, metal on sun-warmed plank, a rhythm like a lazy metronome. Conversation thinned and then died. Sheriff Morrison's head turned. Garrett's hand paused on the lever. The judge's mouth pinched, irritation already loaded into his throat. A man stepped onto the platform. He wore a black hat set crook and a long brown duster powdered in trail dust and older stains. Whiskey clung to him like another garment. He swayed, caught himself on the rail, and blinked at the afternoon as if it were brighter than he preferred. Drifter, the square decided. All at once, together. Trouble, several mouths decided silently after. This is a legal proceeding, Judge Blackwood said. Impatience snapped clean. Move along before you find yourself in custody for disturbing the peace. The stranger tipped his hat a fraction, then let it fall back askew. When he spoke, his words came slurred but oddly clear. Legal, is it? You call this legal? He swept one loose arm toward Marlowe, nearly losing his balance and laughing at his own misstep. Hanging a girl looks like she never harmed a fly? What'd she do? Robbed the sun? No one answered. A cough, a boot scuff, the creak of rope, those spoke instead. Marlowe opened her eyes, drawn by the peculiar gravity of the man's voice. He didn't look like rescue.
He looked like the kind of problem that left before it broke anything. Yet his gaze, red-rimmed as it was, carried a sharpness that measured the square in one sweep. The men near guns, the judge's smirk, her tremor, the crowd's unease. "She's a thief. She stole valuable property from my wife. The law is clear." "Your wife," he echoed, tasting the convenience. "Judge, jury, and victim under one roof. Efficient." He let the word hang, then shrugged. "Still, I like to hear what passes for evidence round here. You catch her with the necklace, or did the thing simply wander off while she happened to be in the general vicinity?" Blackwood's jaw worked. She was the only one present. So no necklace found on her. The man swayed again, but his questions landed like nails. No witness but the lady of the house. Court-appointed counsel with a nap for a strategy, and now a rope? Garrett's fingers tightened on the lever. Blackwood flicked a glance that said now. Sheriff Morrison shifted, not quite in time. The executioner hesitated anyway, caught in the crowd's widening stare. "Final warning," the judge snapped. "Stand down." "Happy to," the stranger said, and the slur combed out of his voice as if he had decided it had served its purpose. He reached into his coat with two slow fingers and drew something small and tarnished that made the front rows gasp before the back ones knew why. A star, dented and dulled, but undeniably official, caught the sun. "Deputy United States Marshal," he announced without theatrics, letting the badge speak. The square inhaled. Even the children forgot the glass. Blackwood's color left him in a single efficient wave. His hand drifted toward his pistol and froze, recalculating. The marshal tucked the badge away and, for the first time, addressed Marlowe as if she existed apart from the rope. "Name's Caleb Mackenzie," he said quietly. Then to the judge, "About that law, let's start over. Trial length? Evidence recovered? Defense permitted to do more than blink?" No thunder followed him, only the plain insistence of questions that should have been asked days ago. In the pause that followed, the square felt different, the gallows less like a machine and more like a question mark. Marlowe breathed. It still hurt, but for the first time since the cell door had clanged, the next breath arrived before she had to beg it to.
Caleb Mackenzie didn't rush the silence that followed the flash of his tarnished star. He let it sit heavy as a judge's gavel, the kind that made men measure their words before they risk them. The square breathed out and then held its breath again. 40 faces, all suddenly unsure which way the wind would turn, watched the drunken stranger transform, only a little, into something steadier. He still swayed as if the boards moved under him, but the minute weight of the badge had anchored his voice. "Since we're talking law," he said, addressing the platform as a whole, but keeping his eyes on Judge Blackwood, "we're going to talk in the only order it understands. Charge, proof, process." He lifted a finger for each like a schoolmaster with dust on his boots. Charge, theft. Proof, missing necklace. Process, a trial quick enough to fit between lunch and a nap. A few nervous laughs died in throats. Sheriff Wade Morrison shifted his stance, caught between reflex and dawning duty. Garrett Walsh, the executioner, kept his palm hovering over the lever as if it were a skittish animal he didn't quite trust. Marlowe Thorne, the rope still teasing panic along her throat, stood very still and tried to let the marshal's voice be larger than the drumbeat under her ribs. Blackwood adjusted the set of his shoulders, gathering his dignity like a robe. "Marshal," he said, putting acid on the title, "you mistake yourself. Jurisdiction rests here. The townsfolk have witnessed a lawful finding. Evidence was presented. Counsel offered. Verdict rendered." "What evidence?" Caleb asked.
No drawl on the question, only the clean edge of steel being checked for rust. Be plain. The defendant was alone in my house when my wife's emerald necklace went missing. So, absence is presence and presence is guilt, Caleb said. That's a neat trick for a man who likes his definitions tidy. He tilted his head toward the crowd. Anyone here see the necklace on this woman? Any of you good people watch her tuck emeralds into her skirt and take a stroll through town jingling like Sunday offering? Silence, thick as tar. A child's whisper about the Marshal's hat got shushed into nothing. Blackwood's jaw flexed. We are not beholden to entertain. You'll entertain the truth, Caleb cut in, not raising his voice and somehow making it carry farther. He swayed a little, caught himself again. Because I rode in and smelled something off, and when the law smells rot, it follows the flies. He eased his hand toward the leather flap of his saddlebag. Blackwood's pistol leaped half out of its holster. Half a dozen other hands twitched toward iron. Sheriff Morrison's palm came up, slow, peacekeeping. Caleb froze, fingers spread, the picture of a man determined not to spook any horses, human or otherwise. "Let me save you some aiming," he said. "I came to show you what you forgot to look for." The fingers curled. The flap fell open. He drew out a spill of green fire that caught the merciless sun and threw it back at the town. Gasps leapt from the crowd like sparks from a dry log. The necklace lay across his palm, its gold chain liquid as a stream, the clasp distinct enough that half the women present could have named its maker. "There's your proof," Caleb said, or rather, proof of where it wasn't. He lifted it higher for the back rows, for the children peering through wavy glass. "Found it buried an hour past, in the garden behind a certain lawman's house. Funny place for a thief to leave another woman's jewels, unless the thief wanted them close." Blackwood's color drained, then surged back ugly and high. "Planting evidence is a crime, Marshal." "So is planting it the first time," Caleb said, and drew from the bag a length of silk, blue, rimmed with damp dirt, pattern familiar enough to draw a string of startled murmurs. Marlowe's knees threatened to go. The rope steadied her like a cruel hand. She looked from the silk, to the emeralds, to the judge's face, and saw something she hadn't expected to see there. Fear, thin and quick, darting under his practiced anger like a fish under ice. Mrs. Patterson found her courage first. The teacher's voice, trained to carry over the scrape of chalk and the shuffling of shoes, lifted from the cluster of townsfolk. "Marlowe came to me that night," she said. "Said she'd seen something in the garden and was frightened nobody would hear her." Samuel Mueller, the storekeeper, nodded, shame already rising color to his cheeks. "She told me, too. I reckoned it was, well, I reckoned wrong." Sheriff Morrison turned to the judge with a face he didn't quite recognize as his own, a face not waiting for orders. "Judge?" Blackwood's mouth tried 3 answers and rejected each. His hand, still near his gun, trembled a fraction. He had ruled by being immovable. Now the boards of his platform felt like a raft. "This is collusion," he managed. "A drunk and a seamstress and a pack of townspeople whipped into sentiment." Caleb slid closer to Marlowe, putting his body between the judge's temper and the girl's vulnerable place above the trap. He spoke without looking at Blackwood, addressing Morrison instead. "Sheriff, I came through Carson way, 3 years too late to stop a theft of public money. A man named Henry Blackstone took $50,000 in territorial funds and vanished west. The papers caught his measure. The warrants caught air. I kept riding. The trail went thin, and then warm again. Brought me here." He finally looked at the judge and let the next word land with the weight of a hammer. "Harrison." A ripple moved through the crowd, not loud yet, but with a current in it. Names mattered in places like Bitter Creek. Names were claim stakes. If one could be switched, what else could be? "You slander me," Blackwood said, but the contempt he usually wore like a well-fitting coat sat crooked now. "You have no jurisdiction." "I got a badge and a necklace that says your story leaks like a barrel with no hoops," Caleb replied. He nodded toward the rope above Marlowe's head. "And I've got a woman you tried to make into a lesson because she saw the wrong thing at the wrong time." Garrett Walsh, who'd looked like a man resigned to a job he didn't relish, took his hand off the lever entirely. He stepped back as if the wood had decided to reject him. "Judge," he said, voice dry, "you told me this was clean." "It is," Blackwood insisted, but the square had eyes again, open ones, and the script had unrolled in a way he hadn't written. "Step away from the prisoner," he snapped at Caleb, and when the marshal didn't, he pulled his gun. The air went knife-sharp. Mothers grabbed children. Men drew a breath they might have to hold for a very long time. Caleb did not draw. He lifted his empty hand, the one not holding emeralds, and spoke to the gun as if it were a skittish horse. "Easy," he said. "You shoot, and it won't be me that gets hit. You'll crack this whole town open, and law don't survive shrapnel." He set the necklace gently on the platform rail, as if to prove he hadn't come to play sleight of hand. And then he moved his other hand, slow as a clock, toward the knot binding Marlowe's wrists. The rope rasped. The crowd heard it, the way a congregation hears the first notes of a hymn they all know. "Don't," Blackwood warned, voice thinning. "Do," Sheriff Morrison countered. And the word coming from him surprised everyone, himself most of all. He took one pace toward the judge, palm out. "Put the gun down, Harrison." For a beat, the square held two futures in its teeth. And then, from the far edge of the street, a woman's voice cut across the width of the day like a thrown blade. "Harrison!" it cried, ragged with running. "Harrison, stop! She knows about Rebecca!" Heads turned. Elizabeth Blackwood, hair undone and blue hem ragged, stumbled into view with a fistful of crumpled letters. The name she hurled into the light did what Caleb's badge and the garden's secret had begun. It split the lie clean down its middle.
Elizabeth Blackwood climbed the gallows steps with the desperate clatter of a woman outrunning her own fear. Pins spilled from her hair like falling beads. The blue of her dress flashed in torn, muddied ruffles that matched the scrap Caleb had pulled from his saddlebag. In her fist, letters shook as if they had a life apart from her hand. She faced her husband first, and the softness that once lived in her eyes was gone. "Harrison," she said, breath broken, "stop." She saw Rebecca's letters. The name struck the square like a thrown stone breaking a pane. Conversations shattered into silence. Judge Harrison Blackwood's gun wavered, then dipped a finger's width, as if gravity itself suddenly argued against him. He looked older in that instant, the silver in his hair less regal and more ash. Caleb Mackenzie didn't move toward his own weapon. He didn't need to. The name had done the work he'd come to do. "Who is Rebecca?" Caleb asked, voice even. He posed the question to the judge, but his eyes never left Elizabeth. He was measuring her resolve, testing if it could carry the weight of truth through a crowd that had long preferred spectacle. Elizabeth swallowed, looked briefly at Marlowe's rope-bruised throat, and chose the straightest path. "His first wife," she said, each word separate and precise, so there could be no mistake. "In Carson City. He told me she died. She didn't." She opened her hand, and the letters unfurled. Ink faded, endearments plain,
dates stubborn with their refusal to disappear. The closest townsfolk leaned in and saw what they needed. Paper that traveled farther than a lie. Signatures that didn't match the name the judge wore. A murmur rolled outward and then turned to something heavier. Mrs. Patterson's chin lifted a fraction, in the posture of someone who had taught children to sound out tricky words and was now watching a whole town pronounce a painful one. Tom Fletcher, who had come for finality, stared as if he'd stumbled into a class he hadn't meant to attend. Sheriff Wade Morrison took one measured step toward the judge and spoke in a voice that surprised him with its steadiness. "Harrison, lower the gun." Blackwood, Henry Blackstone behind the borrowed name, tried for contempt and found only a fraying thread of it. "This is the Marshal's theater," he said, but his glance kept skittering to the letters as if they were lit coals. "He's whipped you up on gossip." Caleb's hand returned to the knot at Marlowe's wrists, slow and visible. "Gossip is what people whisper when truth scares them," he said. "These are letters, and there's more where that came from." He angled his voice to reach the square. "Henry Blackstone stole $50,000 in territorial funds 3 years ago and disappeared. A man with that habit doesn't stop at money. He steals names. He steals courts. He steals the lives that pass through 'em." Marlowe stood very still, trying to make her breath behave. The rope still chafed, the mark beneath it a hot circle. But hope loosened the vice around her ribs. She watched the judge's hand, not out of morbid fascination, but because she had learned that safety sometimes looks like the small distance between a finger and a trigger. Elizabeth took another step, close enough now that the letters brushed Harrison's coat. "I helped him," she said, not sparing herself. "I tore the silk, wrapped the necklace, and buried it in our garden because I believed him when he said the girl would be trouble. I believed him when he said nobody would credit her word over mine." Her voice thinned. "I won't believe him any more." For a heartbeat, Harrison's face fought itself. Habit against consequence. Bluster against final accounting. Then the muscles in his arm lost their argument. The gun dropped to his side. Morrison moved at once, his hand quick and sure, easing the weapon free like a man disarming a friend who'd become a stranger. The sheriff didn't gloat. Duty rarely looks like triumph up close. Caleb's knife flashed once, brief and practical. The rope above Marlowe's head parted with a dry snap and fell, dead weight, to the planks. Relief didn't come like a shout. It came like air, deep and shaking, and so clean it hurt. Marlowe's legs wobbled. Caleb shifted to steady her, palm light at her elbow, the gesture respectful of a dignity the day had tried to take. "Thank you," she managed. Her voice sounded borrowed, but it belonged to her. "Breathe," he said. "The rest can wait for after breathing." Around them, the square resumed motion. A woman sobbing into both hands. A man swearing softly into his fist. Children being turned gently away from the sight of a noose coiled like a snake that hadn't struck. Garrett Walsh, executioner no longer, backed off as if the trap itself had judged him unfit. He stared at his hands as though expecting to find rope burned into his palms. Morrison lifted his voice. "Elizabeth Blackwood," he said, the formal cadence returning as he found the comfort of procedure. "You'll come with me on charges related to concealing evidence. Harrison, Henry, you are under arrest for fraud, corruption, and, by the look of this, bigamy on top of the rest." He nodded toward Caleb. "And whatever else the marshals brought paper for." Caleb's answer was a short nod. He didn't savor the moment. Men who hunt ruin never mistake the first confession for the last piece of the map. "There's more in the house," he said. "We'll need to search. Records, ledgers. This garden secret won't be the only one. Harrison's knees wavered as Morrison clasped irons on his wrists. He looked past the sheriff, past the marshal, to the crowd that had cheered his verdicts and feared his displeasure. He seemed startled to find no one eager to prop him up. Power, it turned out, had been a mirror. When he fell away from it, he couldn't recognize his own face. Elizabeth offered her hands with no argument. She did not ask for mercy. She had chosen a different thing, truth, the only currency the square would accept now. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward then, not to defend or condemn, but to bear witness. "I will give my statement," she said. "I should have spoken louder before." "So should I," Samuel Mueller added, voice thick. "No more quiet." Marlowe pressed fingers to the raw ring at her throat and discovered the tremble had moved to her knees. Caleb guided her to sit on the edge of the platform. She hated the boards, their smell, their groan, their history, and sat anyway. Sometimes a person chose the hardest thing just to prove that choice was still hers. "What now?" she asked, looking up at him. "Now the hard part," he said. "We turn a spectacle into a process. We put ink to paper. We pull every nail out of the judge's house and see which ones got hammered through somebody else." He studied the crowd, their faces changing as they watched themselves change. "And we do it slow, because fast is how he got away with it in the first place." The square began to move in the new direction. Morrison led the prisoners down the steps, past people who did not spit and did not sneer, but did not look away. Caleb picked up the necklace, evidence now, not ornament, and handed the blue silk to Elizabeth for one last confirming glance before it went into the sheriff's bag. Marlowe watched the coil of rope where her feet had been, and understood that there are scars the body wears, and scars a town does. As the crowd dispersed into tight, intent conversations, a breeze ran through Bitter Creek and lifted the dust just enough to make the sunlight visible. It laid a faint glow on Marlowe's face, on the letters in Elizabeth's hand, on the badge at Caleb's chest, and on the empty space above the trap, where, moments before, a life had been measured by the width of a lever. The day hadn't turned merciful exactly. It had turned honest. And in a place that had forgotten the difference, that felt like the first miracle it could trust.
Sheriff Wade Morrison unlocked the judge's front door as if it might bite. The house smelled of lemon oil and distance, all polished surfaces and rooms aired for people who were never truly welcome. Caleb Mackenzie stepped over the threshold with the careful stride of a man who expected traps that weren't nailed to the floor. Behind them, 2 deputies from the jail hovered in the hallway, hats in hands, uncertain whether to feel proud or ashamed to be inside the most powerful home in Bitter Creek. "Start at the places a guilty man trusts," Caleb said, voice low. "Bedroom, desk, boots." He didn't bark orders, he issued instructions the way a carpenter marks where the saw will go. Morrison nodded, grateful for the shape of a plan. He led them through the parlor with its heavy drapes and formal chairs that looked like they punished backs for relaxing. Family portraits watched, more paint than blood in their eyes. A clock ticked with the same officious precision Blackwood had used when he snapped his silver watch. Time here had believed in him. In the judge's bedroom, boots gleamed like arguments proved. Morrison reached for them and found, beneath the polished leather, a steel strongbox with a drunkard's dent in one corner, as if some earlier life had tried to kick its way out. He set it on the bedspread and worked the lock with a pick from Caleb's pocket toolkit. The lid gave with a small sigh that sounded too human. Inside lay tidy stacks of paper that had not been kept to be beautiful.
Deeds with names shaved thin and rewritten thick, bills of sale that pretended to be something else, correspondence on stiff paper whose signatures made Morrison's stomach go hard. He spread them across the bed like a gambler laying down a losing hand, card by card, hoping the pattern would change and knowing it would not. Caleb didn't smile, didn't frown. He read. His finger traced the line where a rancher's boundary had been moved with ink instead of fence posts. He held to the lamp a court record whose verdict had been altered in a hand as neat as a school slate. "This is the shape of it," he said, "not just the taking, but the making. He didn't steal moments, he manufactured outcomes." They moved to the study. The desk was a fortress with drawers like battlements. Morrison worked each one until a false back refused to stay obedient and slid forward, revealing a leather-bound journal that had been hidden not out of fear but out of habit. Caleb opened it in the middle and found not so much confession as bookkeeping. Dates, names, sums, favors owed, favors paid. It was the kind of document men keep when they trust no one's memory, not even their own. "Read this," Caleb said, passing it to the sheriff. Morrison did, and watched his own town unspool in awful clarity. Here a widow's lien resolved for a payment she could never have afforded. There a drifter's quick hanging justified with a witness who had been at a different side of the territory that day. He turned a page, and the ink seemed to darken. "Hernandez," he said softly, "I thought—" He stopped. Thought what? That his doubt absolved him? That thinking something was off counted as action? He closed his mouth on the excuse before it formed. "We'll find that family if any part of it still breathes," he said instead. Caleb nodded once, a small approval that functioned like mercy. "We'll need statements, Mrs. Patterson, Muller, anyone else who heard the girl speak up and kept quiet." He slid the stack of deeds into a satchel, then the altered court papers, then the letters Morrison had already logged, then the journal itself. Evidence, not story. He knew the difference mattered. Back across town, the square had not returned to normal. It had found something new to be. People stood in clusters built from old ties and fresh shame. Some stared at the gallows as if daring it to speak. Some avoided looking at all. Mrs. Patterson had turned her school slate into a ledger of names, cases to revisit, widows to notify, sons to bring home, if home was left. Samuel Mueller handed out coffee he forgot to charge for, his ledger kept in a different part of himself today. Marlowe Thorne sat on the mercantile stoop with a shawl around her shoulders she didn't need. The tremor had left her hands, but still visited in small aftershocks along her ribs, the body's way of paying down a debt to panic. Elizabeth Blackwood, no longer a judge's wife, just a woman with ink on her fingers, waited behind bars 2 streets over, answering questions without embroidery. Harrison, Henry, sat in the other cell, wrists banded in iron, eyes fixed on a knot in the wood as if he could will it open and crawl inside. Caleb and Morrison returned with their satchel of paper and a look between them that told the square they had found exactly what everyone feared and more. The sheriff mounted the steps of the jail and spoke so all could hear. He didn't perform, he reported. "We have documents, many, showing bribes, falsified records, theft, and wrongful convictions. These will go to the territorial authorities. A prosecutor's been telegraphed for. There will be a review of every case handled under Judge Harrison Blackwood." He paused, then added the part that let men breathe. "We will make right what we can." A murmur went through the crowd, not relief yet, but traction. People wanted orders. They were given tasks. Mrs. Patterson took affidavits. Tom Fletcher rode out to a ranch that had changed hands on paper alone. 2 men went to fetch the traveling preacher to witness statements that would bear weight in distant courts. The gallows stood and listened, and, for the first time in years, had nothing to do. Caleb found Marlowe on the stoop and handed her a tin cup. "Drink," he said. She did. The coffee tasted like earth and burnt sugar and the end of a long night. "What happens to her?" Marlowe asked, glancing toward the jail where Elizabeth waited. "She answers for her peace," Caleb said. "Cooperation cuts rope shorter. Not to nothing." He didn't dress it softer than that. Mercy without accounting felt too much like the old way. "And him?" "Paper and iron." Caleb's voice held no triumph. "Maybe a gallows in a jurisdiction that does proof first." He tipped his hat back, let the brim lift enough for the town to see his eyes. "But some men live long in small rooms. That's its own kind of sentence." Marlowe nodded. She looked toward the platform and didn't flinch. "They ought to burn it," she said, "in the day, so it can't pretend to be a shadow." "They will," he said, "after we're sure no one needs it for evidence." It wasn't a joke, but it made her mouth curve anyway. The day had taken laughter. That small return felt like an honest wage. By dusk, the satchel of proof sat on the sheriff's desk, tagged and logged. Morrison wrote until his hand cramped, and then he switched hands and wrote some more. Caleb telegraphed the capital, his message stripped of color. Names, dates, statutes violated, custody confirmed. When he stepped out into the cooling evening, the square had thinned to knots of 3 and 4, earnest conversations replacing gossip. A child kicked a hoop past the gallows, not because it had become ordinary, but because children test the edges of the world to see if they hold. The hoop rolled on and didn't strike the steps. Caleb leaned on the rail outside the jail and watched Bitter Creek learn how to be a town again. He didn't mistake this feeling for victory. He had been around too many corners where victory turned into a different mess. But he recognized steadiness when it arrived. He let himself have that. "Marshal," Morrison said, emerging with ink on his knuckles, "you staying?" "For a while," Caleb answered. "Long enough to help stack the bones straight. After that, I'll read the wind." Morrison nodded, relief visible in the drop of his shoulders. "We burn the scaffold tomorrow." "In daylight," Caleb said, "with everyone watching." He turned his badge so it caught the last smear of sun. "So the next time someone tries to build a faster kind of justice, they'll remember how slow the right kind took, and why it was worth it."
They burned the gallows at noon because daylight left fewer places for shame to hide. Sheriff Wade Morrison stacked kindling himself, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Tom Fletcher hauled boards that once held a trap steady. Mrs. Patterson read a psalm whose words sounded less like vengeance than repair. The rope shriveled first, twisting into a blackened question mark before it curled and vanished. Children stood back with their parents, fingers tucked in larger hands, watching a lesson no slate could hold. When the crossbeam toppled, a low sound moved through Bitter Creek. Something like relief, something like grief, something like both at once. Caleb Mackenzie kept a ledger of a different sort that day. He moved among the clusters, listening, assigning, promising only what paper and witnesses could honor. The satchel of ledgers, forged deeds, and letters lay on the sheriff's desk under lock, each item tagged in Morrison's careful hand. Telegraphed replies had already rattled back from the territorial capital. A prosecutor would arrive within the week. A commission would reopen every case the judge had touched. That promise was a narrow bridge over a wide river, but it was a start the town could put its weight on.
Elizabeth Blackwood, cooperating, exhausted, unflinching, signed statement after statement. She neither begged nor defended, she answered. When someone brought her water, she drank. When the deputy asked if she needed rest, she said, "after," and meant it. Harrison Blackwood, or Henry Blackstone as the warrants named him, sat very quietly in his cell and stared at nothing. The performance had left him. Only the sums remained. He was a man counting, at last, the cost. By afternoon, Bitter Creek had a rhythm again, new, awkward, earnest. Samuel Mueller forgot to charge for coffee. Nobody reminded him. A list of names grew on Mrs. Patterson's chalkboard: Hernandez, Whitaker, Collins, O'Rourke. Families whose verdicts would be pulled apart and stitched true where possible. A boy ran notes between storefronts with the solemnity of a clerk. A girl fetched ink and wiped nibs. Men who had never spoken beyond prices compared memories under the shade of the mercantile awning. The square felt less like a theater and more like a workshop. Marlowe Thorne sat on the Mueller stoop with a length of calico in her lap and a needle she threaded only to keep her hands busy. The ring on her throat had faded from raw to red, a circle that would soften in time but never forget itself. People passed and nodded with a care that wasn't pity exactly, more like recognition, as if seeing her now required they see themselves too. Marlowe found that she could return their looks without shrinking. Terror had taken her voice. Truth returned it. Shy at first, then steadier. Caleb crossed to her when the scaffold's last beam fell in on itself. He stood with the awkwardness of a man who knew how to rehang a door, but not always what to do with gratitude. "You plan to stay?" she asked, not looking up from the neat path of the needle. "For a spell," he said, "long enough to help the prosecutor map the mess. After that, there's always another judge somewhere talking louder than the law." She smiled at that, a small wry curve. "Then you'll keep busy." "Likely." They watched smoke feather the sky. It drifted toward the hills, and for a long while neither spoke. Finally, Marlowe folded the calico and tucked the needle into the cloth. "I think I'll go," she said. "Not because this town isn't worth mending, but because I want to sew somewhere that doesn't smell like rope when it rains." "Denver?" he asked, as if he'd been holding the word in his pocket for her to claim. "Denver," she said, tasting the shape of it. "A place big enough that a woman with a needle can build a name that isn't an apology." He nodded, as if the map had just clarified. "I'll write the governor's office to see you're owed pay for what the court took. The room you kept, the work you lost. Might be they answer slow. I'll stand on their porch if they don't." "Thank you," she said, and meant for more than the letter. He tipped his hat in a way that answered the rest. The prosecutor arrived 3 days later with a valise of forms and a temper that preferred ink to oratory. Trials did not erupt. Processes began. Witnesses lined benches, statements unfurled. Verdicts were weighed against ledgers that had mistaken themselves for law. 2 men walked out of cells they should never have entered. 3 wagons rolled out to find families told to leave on false orders. Not every story ended clean. Some names would only be cleared on paper, spoken over headstones with the kind of apology a town owes its dead. But the machine that had broken people for sport no longer ran, and that mattered. On the morning Marlowe left, Bitter Creek gathered without speeches. Mrs. Patterson pressed paper and pencils into Marlowe's hands. "To write receipts," she said briskly, and then, softly, "and letters." Samuel Mueller tucked a parcel of notions into her carpet bag. Spare needles, a good thimble, a handful of buttons that didn't match but would be perfect for someone bold. Morrison lifted his hat and then, surprising himself, offered a shy, "If Denver has a sheriff needs vouching for, tell them you know one who improved." Laughter, real, loosened the tightness in the air. Caleb stood a step apart, as if keeping watch on a horizon only he could see. When Marlowe faced him, he didn't try for speeches. "There's a shop front on Larimer Street gets good afternoon light," he said. "Tell the landlord I sent you. He owes me for finding his mule last spring." "I'll make the windows worth looking through," she said. "I don't doubt it." The stage rattled and jingled. Marlowe climbed aboard. She did not look back at the post where the gallows had stood. She looked forward, past the horses' ears, toward a road that bent itself around hills and then unspooled straight into sky. As the coach rolled, she took out the paper Mrs. Patterson had given her and wrote her name at the top. The letters held steady. In Denver, the sign would read Thorn and Thread, and girls with tired eyes would find work there, and no one would hang for someone else's lies. Caleb watched the dust settle, felt the small tug that came when good people left, and the work stayed. He spent 2 more years in Bitter Creek, long enough to build habits that outlasted him. Open ledgers, slow trials, a courthouse smaller than a man's pride, and bigger than his secrets. When the appointment came making him territorial marshal, Morrison shook his hand like a man who believed in second chances, including his own. That autumn, wind scoured the hill where the scaffold had burned and carried the last ash out over the prairie. Children ran through that patch and didn't know why their mothers smiled when they did. In the evening, Caleb paused at the edge of the square and touched 2 fingers to his brim, a private salute. To a seamstress who turned survival into a trade, to a town that learned the difference between quick verdicts and slow justice, to a rope that did not get the last word. Stories traveled after that. Some told it as the day a drunken cowboy saved a girl, some as the fall of a judge. The truest versions kept the center where it belonged, on a woman who stood still long enough for a town to find its courage, and on the slow, stubborn work that followed. Ink, affidavits, reconciled ledgers, rebuilt trust. The fire had been dramatic. What came after was better. It held.